In the early hours of Monday, January 17, 1994, one of the biggest natural disasters in Los Angeles history took place. A magnitude 6.7 earthquake centered in Northridge struck the Southern California area. In the frightening and confusing first hour after the earthquake, fire rescue teams were dispatched to collapsed buildings, freeway overpasses, fires, and other emergencies around Southern California. One of those locations was an apartment complex in the northwest San Fernando Valley that became a scene of sorrow and resilience. Few buildings illustrated the deadly power of the earthquake like the 163-unit Northridge Meadows apartment complex at what was then the address of 9565 Reseda Blvd. At Northridge Meadows, located about 2 miles from the epicenter, the shaking of the earth had caused the upper levels of the wood frame structure to collapse on first-floor residents, many of whom were asleep before the shaking began that early morning. It was reported that it took emergency responders almost an hour to respond to the apartment. However, as it turns out, sirens had actually driven past Northridge Meadows within the first 10 minutes, but wailed past the complex. Los Angeles City Fire Department Captain Bob Fickett and his 6-man crew later attested that they had indeed seen the damage at Northridge Meadows, but did not stop. Earthquake procedures demanded that they first survey the entire neighborhood in order to survey the damage and determine what was the most critical. It would appear that the firefighters were mistaken and thought Northridge Meadows was a 2-story apartment building that had seemingly suffered partial but not severe damage from the earthquake, as opposed to an actual 3-story apartment that had collapsed onto itself, trapping many of the first-floor occupants who were helpless inside. "I think they just drove by and thought, 'That's a 2-story building,'" said one occupant who was left bewildered by seeing the emergency crews drive by. Also to take into consideration was the fact that it was 4:30 in the morning, which at the time of year is fairly dark. Emergency responders driving by may have not been able to really see the extent of the damage. In fact, some parts of the first floors had seemingly, from all outside appearances, remained intact. This photograph shows the main entrance, which had not fully collapsed. However, it is at a closer look that one can see the stress and lean of the main support walls. The collapse may have instantly killed some. However, there is thought to be an unlucky few that may have been trapped and suffocated, or slowly succumbed to injuries as a result of the collapse. This detail became more apparent during the later recovery, where many of the deceased were found with painful and unnaturally contorted facial expressions. Fire rescue teams searched the rubble for survivors, but the death toll continued to rise throughout the day. In the end, 16 of the 57 people killed in the earthquake died at Northridge Meadows, the highest death toll at any single location. Lost within debris were the lives of many, which were forever changed or taken altogether. Jerry Green's family knew something was wrong when they had not heard from him shortly after the earthquake. Jerry's brother-in-law and niece subsequently decided to go to the Northridge Meadows apartment and knock on the window of Jerry's first-floor apartment to get his attention. However, what they did not realize is that the window they were knocking on was not that of the first floor, but the second floor, which had pancaked on top of Jerry's apartment, in which he was later found deceased. Cecilia and David Pressman, both 71, had been married for 51 years. David was already retired and Cecilia was due to retire the following May. During the recovery, Cecilia and David's bodies were found together in their bed in a tight embrace. Much like the Pressmans, Sharon Engler, 58, and her husband Phil, 62, were two found together in their beds holding hands. Adam Slotnick, 28, had recently relocated to Northridge for a new job as a manager at a pizza joint, Pizzeria Uno. When Slotnick failed to show up the morning of the quake, some employees rushed to the ill-fated Northridge Meadows, where he occupied a ground-floor apartment. They reached the complex in time to see firefighters pull Adam out of the rubble.
This is a friend of his who was in the bottom floor of this building. When was the last time you heard from him? What are your concerns now?
Talked to him yesterday. All we're trying to do right now, sir, is we're trying to get the fireman to go to his apartment specifically because we know he's there.
Now, which apartment is he in?
111.
So you believe he was caught and was one of the victims?
Almost no question. Someone was with him at 1:30 in the morning. Another employee saw his car here at 10:30 in the morning. We know he's there. We just want him to go in and get him out. I mean, he could still be alive.
In the past few minutes, we've just found another victim who is deceased. I can tell you at this time we have not completely uncovered the victim. We've got an entire floor sitting on top of the area where he's at. It's compressed into about 3 feet. His 8 foot of space is compressed into about 3 feet. And all of the rubble is on top of this particular individual.
Is this an individual you've been looking for all along?
At this point, we can only say that we have one victim in that room.
The fire chief informed Slotnick's loved ones that he most likely died instantly and did not suffer any pain. Darla Ray Enos, 43, was having an early cup of coffee on the couch with her husband James in their Northridge Meadows apartments when the quake began. The couple was hurled in different directions. After James regained consciousness and found himself trapped under rubble, he urgently called out for his wife. She would never answer. In apartment 101, mechanic Pil Soon Lee was already up quietly brushing his teeth to avoid waking his wife and their 2 sons. When the intense shaking from the quake occurred, his wife, Yoon Suk Lee, a nurse, thought her husband was doing something to shake the apartment. She quickly realized she was wrong. A slender woman, she literally flew through the air as the tremors intensified. When she landed, she found the ceiling on top of her. She was bruised and cut across the knee, but alive. Suk Lee screamed for her sons and her husband. There was no response from Pil Soon or their older son, Howard, 14. But finally, her 12-year-old son, Jason, answered. His legs were pinned. Unable to move herself, she told him to fight free of the debris. He cried that he couldn't. "Keep trying," his mother commanded. Finally, Jason yanked his legs free, straining so hard that he dislocated his right leg. The toes on his other foot were crushed and bleeding, but Jason began crawling in the rubble. As the dawn broke, Jason squeezed through a 14-inch wide hole and emerged into the arms of other tenants, who, hearing his cries, pulled him free. He had been trapped inside for 45 minutes. It took rescuers 15 more minutes to dig out Hyun Suk Lee. Although they both had miraculously survived, the nightmare for Jason and Hyun only began. As emergency responders tunneled away at the debris, they located the bodies of Howard and Pil Soon Lee, who had both perished in the collapse. Pil Soon's body was the 16th and last to be carried from the building at 10:50 a.m. This photo captures the moment Hyun Suk was given the devastating news about her husband and son's death by firefighter Dave Thompson. After his Northridge Meadows apartment collapsed, Robert Dorsey could see only 12 inches of space between the floor and ceiling. He was trapped in the rubble for 2.5 hours and suffered a cracked rib, cuts and bruises. Unfortunately, Ryan's 3 roommates, Manuel Sandoval, Jamie Reyes, and Myrna Velasquez, died in their beds yards away. Back in the courtyard, Beverly Reading hoped that her friend Ruth Wilhelm, 77, a recent widow who lived in apartment 127, would appear, but she knew hope was slight. Another tenant, Eric Pearson, had tried to save Wilhelm after he happened to see her leg protruding from a pile of beams and hearing her hoarse cries. But when he returned after looking for help, he was met with silence. Desperate, Pearson crawled into the tiny crevice that had been Ruth's bedroom. Unfortunately, she had already passed away. Angeline Cerrone, 80, whom everyone knew as Anne, had lived in apartment 103 for more than 2 decades. When no one answered the phone, her grandson Stephen, 28, rushed over from Van Nuys. When he peered inside what he thought was his grandmother's unit, He was puzzled to see furniture and personal items that he did not recognize. Suddenly, he realized he was squinting into a second-story apartment, and that his grandmother's unit was beneath. She had not survived. Beatrice Reskin, 71, had just retired as a medical assistant and was planning to relocate to Arizona to be with her children. Reskin's body was identified by the Star of David ring she always wore. Bill Running was working an early morning shift when he recognized his mother Carol Running's apartment on the news. Bill rushed to the Northridge Meadows complex with his sister and stood on the sidewalk with news crews waiting for news concerning their mother's whereabouts. It would not be until 3 a.m. that Bill and his sister would receive the devastating call from the morgue that held their mother's body. A few days after the earthquake, the surviving residents of the second and third floor were allowed in the apartments for 15 minutes each at a time to get precious belongings. Unfortunately, loved ones of those deceased on the first floor had to wait until months later for the demolition crews to get to the first floor to recover whatever belongings were still salvageable. In the end, 16 people's fates were sealed and reparations for those lost and the survivors who needed to carry on were demanded. The first step in the healing process was getting answers as to why the destruction of the complex had been so catastrophic. To understand why Northridge Meadows apartments suffered the extensive damage it did is to understand its construction. According to architect Morris Brown, when the 163-unit apartment buildings were constructed in 1973, it was designed to conform to the earthquake codes at the time. It should also be noted here that 1973 was 2 years after the Soma earthquake of 1971, which was the last major earthquake of the same size and location. This means in the 20 years that Northridge Meadows had been built, it had never had to withstand an earthquake of such magnitude. Another problem was the type of building the complex was. Northridge Meadows apartment was what is called a soft-story building. Soft-story buildings are wood-frame structures where the first story is largely open, usually for ground-floor parking. Many of LA's famed dingbat-style apartment buildings, which contain open space for parking on their first floors, are a type of soft-story building construction. Although the style and aesthetic are very renowned, the buildings are disastrous in events like earthquakes, which was witnessed in 1994 with Northridge Meadows. Approximately 49,000 apartment units in LA were destroyed or seriously damaged due to the Northridge earthquake. 2/3 of those were in soft-story buildings like Northridge Meadows, according to a 2006 report from the Public Policy Institute of California. During the controlled demolition of Northridge Meadows that began months after, the apartment building was taken apart piece by piece so that experts could test the wreckage for any construction defects. Lawyers for survivors identified a number of things for what they believed were design flaws and construction defects with the building's wall, foundation, floor, and tuck under garage parking. Attorneys for the building's owner and builder downplayed the importance of such faults, which they contended could be found in many buildings of the time that did not suffer damage in the earthquake. This was true. Although Northridge Meadows had its construction flaws, the building was not much different in design from other buildings in the area that survived the earthquake. There was nothing different, said Nicolino Delle Quadri, chief of the Training Emergency Management Division of the Los Angeles Department of Building and Safety. Typical construction for that time. There's nothing at this time that we found atypical. Arguments on both sides would prove to be in vain. No one would ever truly know what caused the fateful collapse that took 16 lives at Northridge Meadows. In the fall of 1995, an undisclosed settlement of more than $1 million was reached in a massive civil lawsuit over the collapse of the apartment complex. Although relatively small, the settlement included insurance payouts that were estimated to be between $2 and $3 million. The early settlement of the case forbade any suits going to trial, and a jury would never decide whether the collapse of the 3-story, 163-unit apartment building was due to shoddy construction, as the lawsuits contended, or was merely an act of God, as the owner and builder claimed. Although the settlement may have been a relief to the apartment complex's owner and builder, the unanswered questions about the collapse left a cascade of detrimental possibilities and questions about the future of Los Angeles in the event of another earthquake of similar magnitude. According to reports in 2019, there were more than 12,000 soft-story buildings built similar to Northridge Meadows that needed seismic upgrades. An astounding number for an earthquake-prone city like Los Angeles. Owners for about 5,000 buildings at the time had yet to submit retrofitting plans, the first major benchmark in the process. Mandatory building retrofits are part of a larger plan focused on preparing the city to weather and bounce back from a major earthquake. With a 93% chance that an earthquake as big as the deadly Northridge quake or bigger will strike Los Angeles again in less than 30 years, the city's upgrades can't come soon enough, especially for those who know the history that they hope won't repeat itself. Today, the Park Ridge complex stands on the site of the torn-down Northridge Meadows. Construction of the complex was completed in the fall of 1998, only 4 years after the earthquake. The Park Ridge complex cost $16.8 million and was a part of the Northridge quake recovery effort. The complex is dedicated to all 16 victims. Next January will mark the 30th anniversary of the event that claimed their lives and the day that Los Angeles will never forget.